Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final lecture in Unit 2 of this class. We're sort of wrapping up the era of revolutions by discussing the final revolution, if you will, the Imperial Revolution. The one that takes sort of all the ideas that we've been cooking up in Unit 2. Ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas of revolutionary politics, industrial mass society politics, and turns those into a global economic and political phenomenon. Now, in order to understand imperialism, let's look at the map. Because it's important to realize just how different the world looks in only about 100 years. So in the advent of the 7 Years' War, this is what the world looked like. Okay? So you had, at the advent of the 7 Years' War, you had certain countries that I would consider to be multi-continent global empires. There's really four in the world at that time. There was Great Britain, there was France, the Ottomans, and Imperial Russia. Two of those are gunpowder empires, and two of those are colonial empires. Okay? Spain at this point is starting to feel the effects of the Napoleonic Age. And, well, the Ottomans are starting a period of decline. And yet, on the eve of World War I, this is what Africa would look like right on the eve of the First World War. And I think this map makes it even more stark, because you can see here in the corner the map of Africa prior to 1880. You see this carving up of the African continent among the various European powers. The French, the Spanish, the British, the Portuguese, the Belgians, even the Italians have gotten involved in places like Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. In fact, on this entire map, the only country that has been able to achieve some degree of independence is Ethiopia. They're the only ones. But for the rest, European imperial control. In the latter half of the 19th century, each and every industrialized power in Europe is doing this. All of the countries that are experiencing the Industrial Revolution specifically are engaging in imperialism. Note, the Ottomans, for example, not engaging in imperialism, or at least not to this degree. The Russians, not really. It is the countries that are explicitly experiencing the Industrial Revolution that are experiencing imperialism. Why? Why is this happening? Well, there's a couple reasons. We're going to look at two main hypotheses. One of these hypotheses is rooted in the idea that imperialism is about racism, because obviously. And the other claims that imperialism is rooted in economics. I would argue that it's a mixture of both. But let's look at them both. The first is something that I'm going to call the ethno-nationalist hypothesis. The argument being that this is the result of a very pernicious kind of outcome of the Enlightened Revolution. Remember what we said. The Enlightened Revolution, the Enlightenment, was about taking the ideas of the scientific revolution and using them to study us. The thing is, what ends up happening by around the time we get to the late 19th, early 20th century is that and those Enlightenment ideas have begun to be applied to racism. Now, to be clear, scientific racism, the application of these methods to try to justify racism, isn't science. It's not. What it is trying to give racism the veneer of science. to sort of polish that turd just a little bit. Why? It's kind of appealing to something that you might already take for granted. People who are openly racist are counting on the fact that you take science as valid. And so when racism has the veneer of science, if you accept science as valid, you might accept the racism. Okay? But the dirty little secret is that this had existed for the entirety of the Enlightenment. Almost all of the Enlightenment thinkers, at some point or another, had began to do some uncomfortable things, talking about classification of the races, pretending that this is science, or hierarchies of ethnicities, proverbial tier lists of various ethnicities of man, and it's all crap. The thing is, this would have stayed academic and poorly known and poorly written about and poorly studied until there is a groundbreaking discovery and book. Darwin, a naturalist from Great Britain, travels to the Galapagos Islands to study tortoises and leaves there with a theory on the evolution of the species. Now, I want to highlight something about Darwin. That we know Darwin isn't a racist. Darwin doesn't care about this stuff. Darwin's just trying to write a nice book about tortoises. But the origin of the species becomes like a foundational text for the scientific racist community, who take Darwin's ideas and run with it. Because they say, you see, there is a scientific hierarchy of people. And so, scientific racism becomes not about what race can create the most superior society, but rather the idea that people of a certain race or ethnicity were genetically superior. And it's all wrong. It's all crap. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to these people. Okay? Now, a quick note, a quick sort of tangent, if you will, about a common student mistake. Social Darwinism and scientific racism are not the same thing. They're similar ideas that come out of the same place, but social Darwinism is about class, not race. Social Darwinists say that society is a lot like nature, and so society is survival of the fittest. And so if I'm rich and well-to-do, it's because I'm a superior economic being to you. It has nothing really to do about race, although in certain societies, much like in the United States, these things kind of went hand in hand, hence the confusion among predominantly American students. But scientific racism is less explicitly about class and more explicitly about racial hierarchies. And again, I want to highlight, it's all crap. It's all useless. So why bring any of this up? Well, what do we know about the world post the Industrial Revolution? These are mass societies, which elected officials need to start caring about the preponderant opinion of people to get elected. And as scientific racism becomes sort of the dominant ideology amongst people living in mass societies in Europe, they begin to use this idea of scientific racism as a pretense, an excuse, so as to go out in the world system and dominate the other races and ethnicities of the world. Okay? So that's the ethno-nationalist hypothesis, that the desire to go out and dominate the other races was driven by something that Rudyard Kipling would call, quote unquote, the white man's burden. The mission to civilize, if you will. And this was driven by a quote unquote higher purpose. Whatever. I find that to some degree interesting as a normative explanation. I believe that's probably what the European powers would have said openly as a justification for their actions. But I don't think it's the actual reasoning for why imperialism is happening. I think what's more likely happening is that the Imperial Revolution is driven largely by the search for materials, something I am calling the production hypothesis. The production hypothesis emerges as a theory after the Imperial Revolution. And cards on the table, it is the brainchild of one individual, and that individual is Vladimir Lenin. Okay? Lenin is the first one to connect imperialism with the Industrial Revolution. Imperialism with capitalism. Now, Lenin would argue that imperialism is capitalism's final stage. And if this were a poli-sci class, we'd sort of explore what that means, but we don't have time for that. What we need to do is understand Lenin's logic in connecting A to B. Why does Lenin believe that the Industrial Revolution causes imperialism? The answer is in something we've looked at before already. So, we have here the industrial pricing model. I present to you once again the objectively superior flavor of Doritos. Don't at me. Now, I said in our hypothetical example that a bag of Doritos like this costs $1. But that dollar is reflective of certain inputs. You may remember this from our lecture on the Industrial Revolution. Okay? What does that mean? That means it's reflective of at least 3 buckets, 3 inputs. Labor, profit, overhead. Labor, profit, overhead. And we said that in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, in a world where these goods are competing over price, the first thing to give, the first bucket to be addressed, is the labor bucket, where you see all of the innovations of the Industrial Revolution exist fundamentally to lower and depress labor costs. The problem that we saw was that workers were also consumers. And so the less workers made, the less they could afford, which means the lower prices had to be, which means the less workers could make, which means the lower prices had to be. And around and around and around and around and around it went in this circling of the drain. Okay? A negative feedback loop that ultimately dragged the industrial working class to a place of absolute misery. The problem with this is that eventually, there comes a floor. A labor cost floor under which prices could not go anymore. That happens right around the late 1800s. Okay? There comes a point where wages are so low that workers decide it's not even worth it to go to work. I can't afford to eat anyway, so I'd rather have my time back. But the prices still need to keep going down, which means we are still going to have to look at the other buckets. And again, the incentive to reduce profit is 0. And so we have to look at overhead. How can we lower the overhead? The idea is simple. Maybe in business you've heard of this. I know I have a couple business majors in my classes. Maybe you've heard of vertical integration before. Vertical integration is a business concept that says businesses shouldn't just try to buy out their competitors. They should try to purchase their supply chain. So if I'm Coca-Cola, it would be in my interest to go out and purchase an aluminum mine. Why? Because my cans are made of aluminum. And so if I own the aluminum mine, I can get the materials at a cheaper rate, which lowers my cost per unit. Lenin imagines imperialism as being driven by the same motivation. That these countries in the outside of Europe were rich in raw materials, and that these goods would be extracted through the imperial process to Europe, converted into finished goods, and then sent right back. Now that's very important, because what that means is imperialism, yes, is about materials, but is equally about markets. Because what Lenin quickly realizes about the Industrial Revolution is that it is beset by crises, but crises of a different kind. Normally, when I think of an economic crisis, you think of a shortage of some kind. Oh, there's not enough water. Crisis. Oh, there's not enough blank. Crisis. What Lenin argues is that no, because the Industrial Revolution is so good at producing stuff en masse for everyone, that the crises of the Industrial Revolution actually ended up being crises of abundance. We have produced too much stuff. 2008, the housing market bubble burst. Why? We had overproduced houses that were increasingly worthless. 1920s, Great Depression. The Great Depression occurs. Why? The overproduction of high-value consumer goods. Fridges and ovens and dishwashers, all things that were new for the age. The problem is, your average Joe has one fridge, one oven, one dishwasher, right? One washing machine. You don't have more than one in a house. There was a natural limit to how many of these you could sell. And when the economy overproduced and people had over-leveraged themselves in the hope of selling these new goods, explosion. Crises of abundance. What Lenin says is, imperialism, yes, is about getting goods to produce goods for cheaper. Getting raw materials to produce goods for cheaper. But it is also about finding new consumers, new markets to sell your goods. It is about, yes, the extraction of the raw materials out of the developing world. But it is equally about finding new places to sell your goods in. Let me give you the historical example. I gave you the stupid example of corn and Doritos, but let me give you the real example. The Twinings Tea Company, located in the heart of London, and tea companies like it. The British had control over India. How? We'll see in a minute. India produces tea. Tea would be grown and dried in India, sent halfway around the world to Great Britain, where it would be converted into a new invention, the tea bag. And then those tea bags would get sent right back to India for consumption by Indians in the Indian market. The problem is, Lenin argues, that this wasn't a permanent solution. Eventually, you'd run out of consumers in this new market you expanded into. And so you'd need to find another, and another, and another. And every industrial power is doing this. And that's how you get a map like this. The engine of industrial capitalism demands that you as an industrialized country constantly find new markets to expand into, to sell your goods, and kick the can down the road of inevitable economic collapse. The problem is, though, every country is doing this. Land isn't infinite. There is a finite amount of land on Earth. There's an even more finite amount of habited areas, inhabited spaces that humans live in that you can go and sell your tchotchke crap to. What happens when there is no more unoccupied, quote unquote, land available to the imperial powers. Do you think these European powers would be willing to walk away from their cash cow and say, well, that was fun, guys. Time to go back to feudalism? No. But rather, as these lands start to border and jut against one another, you will be forced to take land from your neighbors. All of the European powers, all at once. We call this literally World War I. Lenin says this is what's going to cause a great war between the European powers. Essentially, Lenin is claiming that imperialism will cause the First World War. He calls it before it happens. Which is why, candidly, even though I am not personally a Leninist, I buy it because Lenin is just proven right by events, right? Events work out the way Lenin says it does. And as evidence, here's what I would point out. Years later at the Treaty of Versailles, when Germany is sort of signing the peace treaty that would end the war, as a consequence of the war, Germany agreed to give up each and every one of its colonies all over the world. Now, that may be true. But listen, for a class on imperialism, I've talked a lot about, candidly, Europeans. We've talked about the causes of imperialism in Europe. We need to talk about what this actually looked like. What did imperialism look like for the people suffering under it? Is this just brutal conquest? Or is it more subtle than that? The answer usually depends on who's in charge. So let's begin by looking at imperialism in Asia. Imperialism in Asia is actually a topic that we've talked about all the way back when in Lecture 1. You were so innocent back then. It's been a minute, huh? We talked about Portuguese sailors way back in the mid-1400s, arriving at the southernmost tip of Africa and entering the Indian Ocean. We talked about Portuguese sailors arriving into the Indian Ocean. The thing with the Portuguese is, by its very nature, the Portuguese operation is small. This is not massive expansion. This is about connecting the markets of Europe with the markets of Asia and a transport network connecting goods purchased in Asia to the markets of Europe. We talked about this as a trade post empire. You can see it right here, right? This is the furthest extent of Portuguese trading. And listen, they reach quite a few places. I would highlight there's a Portuguese trading outpost in literally Japan in the mid-1500s, 1542. But you'll notice that this isn't imperialism yet. This isn't mass conquest. This is the Portuguese setting up trading posts all over the world at a very small scale. Okay? The thing is, however, this was an excellent proof of concept, but this was not sustainable in the long term. Why? Because its scale meant it was vulnerable. These trade posts were constantly under threat of attack by local powers, by pirates, by you name it. That means that the Portuguese needed to do one of two things. They either A, needed to keep their hosts on their side, right? Otherwise, their host might say, actually, we want our land back. Also, all the money you had there. Which means paying larger and larger and larger bribes, larger share to local powers. Or B, parking your military in each and every one of these spots and hoping to protect it that way. This wasn't a sustainable thing. This wasn't a long-term program. But the Portuguese have proven the concept. What the Portuguese are able to do is prove to the other European powers that this was possible to do, and that someone with more money and resources could do a lot better than the Portuguese. This ends up being the Dutch. It is the Dutch that roll in and do what is essentially a hostile takeover of the Portuguese trading empire. How are they able to do it? The Dutch invent a new economic system. They call it the corporation. Brass tacks, this is one of the moves away from mercantilism in terms of how it would function. The Dutch East India Company, a private corporation, comes up with this. This is not Portugal government versus Holland government. This is Portugal government versus the Dutch East India Company, private corporation. Now, why was it that the corporations were able to outbid, outmaneuver the Portuguese? The answer is actually relatively simple. You see, what the Portuguese were relying on was fundamentally tax revenue. They're relying on the government's ability to spend and maintain their system. The thing is, that's inherently risky. If I, as the Portuguese, invest in a colony ship, and that ship sinks, I'm out of my money. That's true for all of you. However, what the Dutch East India Company is able to do is spread risk around. So let's imagine, shall we, 10 of you guys are all in business. All of you are investors in trading vessels. So you go down to the port and you say, "You captain, sir, here's my money. I want you to sail to Singapore, purchase some spices, bring them here, and I'll sell them for money." There's 10 of you that do this. But there's also a 1 in 10 chance that a ship will sink on the way there or back. And so congratulations. Investor number 1 makes their money back. Investor number 2 makes their money back. Investor number 3 and 4, you make your money back. Investor number 5, I'm sorry, your ship sank and you lost all your money. You see, by having risks spread out in this way, it's like the world's shittiest game of Duck, Duck, Goose. One of you is going to end up with the hot potato. What the VOC says, no. Don't go out and get the ships yourselves. Give me your money. And in exchange, I will hire and operate a fleet of ships on your behalf and deliver the profits to you. Why does this matter? If one of these ships sinks, you're still guaranteed 9/10 of the profit. All of you, right? Instead of getting 100% of one ship, you're getting 1/10 of every ship. Nothing changes for you, but it's a lot safer this way for all of you. And there's a lot more money to be made as a result. The VOC would indicate your proverbial purchasing of a share of a trading vessel by handing you a proverbial piece of the ship, a plank of wood with the VOC logo emblazoned on it. They call this a stock. That's where the term comes from. You're a stock of the ship, a piece of the ship that was yours to keep, and that indicated that you had purchased a share in the VOC as a company that was delivering profits to you. And everyone in Europe starts to get involved in the VOC. This is the most lucrative company in the history of the world. I think it still is the most lucrative company in the history of the world. Ultimately, these companies have more money to play with. They just have more. As a result, they outspend the Portuguese. They outcompete the Portuguese. And ultimately, the mercantilist royal monopoly goes the way of the dodo. Not so much because Adam Smith disproved it, but because they couldn't compete. You could not compete with what was functionally the privatization of colonialism. So, how did the VOC actually behave? Remember, the VOC, which is the acronym for the Dutch East India Company, don't get it twisted. It's a Dutch acronym. Don't try to ask me how you say it. I won't be able to. I'm just going to call it the VOC out of convenience. The VOC now has to deliver to all of these people that have given them money, expecting a profit. And so they begin an expansion incredibly rapidly, all across modern-day Indonesia, trying to bring back to Europe the most valuable spices known to mankind. Nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, pepper, white and black. These are all incredibly valuable, worth more than their weight in gold in some cases. The problem is that the Dutch East India needs a lot of this fast. And so, the Dutch East India Company creates very real plantations in Indonesia and massacres local people to get the things that they want. But ultimately, by the mid-1700s, this is the most valuable company in the history of the world. At the time of the American Revolution, the Dutch East India Company is massive. And this is kind of where we have to talk about the practicality of all of this. Because Holland is in Europe. The Dutch East India Company operates predominantly in Indonesia on the other side of the world. And without a Suez Canal, communication often took years. In practice, the VOC operates independently. It hires its own mercenaries. It engages in its own diplomacy. It is, in practice, a for-profit country. What about India? The jewel of the Indian Ocean. Well, in India was seen equally, yes, a source of silks and spices and all that, but also a fervent place to sell your goods. Now, we talked about this from the Gunpowder Empire's perspective, from the Mughals' perspective, selling off portions of their land in order to get the things that they wanted, essentially. With no navy to speak of. The Portuguese set up shop first in Goa. I think I've talked about Goa in this class before. A European city essentially transplanted to the coast of India. But they're not the only one. The British start to move in. And the French start to move in. Till eventually the entire coastline is dominated by European powers. The entire coastline of India. But in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, where France gives up its colonies, the British end up with a sizable portion of the Indian coastline. Sizable enough that the British think that they need to create their own version of what the Dutch are doing. The British East India Company. We're going to call this, for the sake of brevity, the EIC. So remember, VOC, Dutch. EIC, British. Now, the British East India Company operates primarily in India. Okay? This is an Indian-based sort of entity. However, as the EIC comes to dominate most of India, you will find that the EIC does some level of expansion. But for the most part, the British face of imperialism isn't what you would expect. The British face of imperialism looks something like this. Now, when I say British imperialism, I would imagine that you would imagine that this map would just be an ocean of red because it belongs to the British. Red from sea to shining sea. But that's not the case, right? The British East India Company does manage certain areas of India directly. But for the most part, the British have left India, politically speaking, alone. This is intentional. You see, the British have realized that there is a more profitable way to manage such a large territory. The British call it rule by and of the natives. Essentially, the British realize instead of rolling in with their army and conquering a place directly, listen, that's expensive and we don't have time for this. The British really only need to get one person on their side, the monarch of an area, or local leaders. So what do the British promise? What do the British promise these local leaders? Security. So long as you're useful to the British, an Indian monarch could expect to stay in charge. British guns would keep them in charge. And, just for good measure, their children would be able to go to Europe, to London, and receive a British education. In fact, one of the most famous anti-colonial voices in India goes to Oxford Law School on this program because Mahatma Gandhi is the son of the the Raj of Porbandar in modern-day Gujarat. This is how he's able to go to Oxford Law, not for any other reason. But the idea was that they weren't going to exert political control. The British planned on exerting economic control. What do the British get out of this? In exchange for the security, in exchange for the opportunity to send their kids to British schools on the British dime, the British East India Trading Company insisted on exclusive trading deals with these kingdoms. So your small-scale subsistence agriculture tea farmer in India who's producing tea and selling his goods on the market, relying on that to feed his family, now finds that he can only sell to the British and pay the price the British are willing to pay. And if they're not willing to pay the price, well, there's no one else to sell to. So tough luck. That's who you have. And vice versa, when you go to buy, all the goods seem to be made in the UK. These kingdoms came to be wholly reliant on the British. Intentionally. Okay? Economic control. That economic control gets to be all the more important as the British introduce a brand new invention to India. The railroad. Railroad that they controlled. So now the infrastructure, the network connecting ports to urban centers are run by the British EIC that only transports British goods and the goods that they purchase. Which means you will only ever be able to sell to the British. This is your only customer. And so, becomes a buyer's market. You have to agree to sell for the price that they're willing to pay, which is year over year, lower and lower and lower and lower. Materials costs. So this is how the British came to control India. But that's not the craziest story of imperialism in Asia. The craziest story of imperialism in Asia are the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars are wild. They're just wild. Because China was considered to be, for most people, the motherlode. Large population, produces everything. China was where European imperial traders wanted to be. Now, European traders had already arrived in China. They had established a trading presence in the southern Chinese port of Canton, modern-day Guangzhou. And the Europeans walk away from this trade understanding that this was potentially the most lucrative Indian Ocean trading route. China had silks, China had tea, China had porcelain, and a massive population. So anyone who could sell European goods in China was going to make a fortune. There's just one problem. By the time European powers get serious about doing imperialism in China, China has wised up to the game. And so the Chinese very firmly, politely but firmly, tell the Europeans to leave them alone and never come back. China has no need for anything coming out of Europe, according to them. The British take this as a challenge. And they think to themselves, what if we could create our own demand? You see, the British have de facto control of the Raj. And you'll notice about the Raj of India is that India, at the time, shares a border with China. Now, there's a certain plant that grows wild and free in the foothills of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. The opium poppy. An agricultural good that, when refined, becomes one of the world's most powerful and addictive narcotics. And so, the plan has come up to turn this into opium and smuggle it into the port of Canton and create an entire population of addicted southern Chinese residents. I cannot make that up. This is some real Breaking Bad sort of things. Regardless, and I apologize for the borderline, not so borderline racism of the next picture, this is a European depiction. But I find it fascinating because around this period of time, the stereotype about China becomes the opium den. This is a stereotype that the British create because the British gave them opium. Regardless, the British recognize that by smuggling opium in illegally, they now have something China wants, or at least Chinese citizens want. So the next day, well, proverbially, historically speaking, the next day, the British show up and loudly announce, hey, are you sure you don't want to do business with us? We have opium. Come on down. The Chinese governor has his orders from the emperor himself and says, no. We told you you're not welcome here. Now get. His citizens freak out. What do you mean? What do you mean there's no opium? No. We want the opium. Go get it. A riot breaks out in Canton. And the governor, in his desperation, shoots at the British mercantile vessel. Or in other words, China has just declared war on the British. This is how the Opium Wars begin. Now, I want to highlight something. Because when I say war, you might think, oh, okay, so they were equal. No, they were not. The British are fighting at a level, thanks in part to the fact that they have fully embraced the Industrial Revolution, and China hasn't. The British are able to gain a victory so complete that even today, the British word for porcelain is China. Because they were able to extract so much porcelain out of China through the one part of China that the British demand. A rock just off of the Canton that the British could set up shop in? Hong Kong. Hong Kong. Now, before you say, well, good thing we as Americans didn't get involved with this. Wrong. Incorrect. We were just a lot less subtle about it. What you're looking at here is Admiral Matthew Perry invading Japan by force, not to conquer, but to set up an exclusive trading agreement. We do this too. The money to be made by doing imperialism in Asia was just too great. Now, this differs dramatically, however, from imperialism in Africa. Imperialism in Africa looks different and feels different to the imperialism that we see in Asia. There's a couple reasons for this. Number one, imperialism in Africa was just easier. You didn't have to sail halfway around the world to do it if you're sailing from Europe. The barrier to entry is lower, which means you see more European countries involved. Where in Asia, you kind of have your usual suspects. You have the British, you have the French, you have the Spanish in the Philippines, you have the Dutch in Indonesia, and the Americans, and the Germans have a couple islands in the Pacific, but nothing crazy. In Africa, Belgium, Portugal, Italy, countries that are not really engaging in imperialism elsewhere, are engaging in imperialism here. That's number one. Number two, if Asia was a known quantity, because the Portuguese had been sailing to Asia for centuries at this point, Africa was this feeling of unknown, that wealth extraction from Africa really hadn't been done yet, and so it was very much an untapped market. And lastly, because it was closer, you could engage in a more direct form of control. Okay? Now, while all of this is true, I want to look at one entity in particular. I want to talk about the Congo. Now, what happens in the Congo is a tragedy, largely driven by one human being, King Leopold II of Belgium. You see, what King Leopold sponsors in Congo is an exploratory expedition led by explorer David Stanley. And what Stanley discovers in Congo is a tree whose sap could be refined into a very potent good with a myriad of industrial applications. Congo is rich in rubber trees. And a moment of silence for the person listening to this just finding out that rubber comes from trees. Yes, it's a sap. It is a refined sap, almost like maple syrup, but not quite as delicious. Regardless, Congo is full of these rubber trees whose sap could be worked and turned into rubber. Leopold II realizes just how much of an untapped market this could be. And so, he decides to sponsor an invasion of the Congo. But what he doesn't want are all the pesky rules that Belgium, as a country with their little constitution, would have in a Congo. Because if Belgium country invades Congo, the Belgian constitution will apply in Congo. And King Leopold says, I don't want to do all that. Rights? Pfft, no, there's money to be made here. The loophole that Leopold finds is, what if this area is the private property of the King of Belgium? No different than my backyard. Put simply, the Congo Free State is the largest territory privately owned as private property of any individual in human history. Legally speaking, the entirety of the Congo, all of it, was Leopold's private property. And Leopold turns this. We talked about the VOC being history's first for-profit country. But I think this is more practically a for-profit country, because the Congo Free State as a name is tremendously ironic. The entire population of the Congo is essentially compelled as a condition of citizenship to work here in rubber extraction. And already, just cards on the table, this is gonna feel a little different. Why? Photography. This is the first picture that I've shown you, photo, of an event in this class. I checked my previous slides. This is it. The earliest days of photography happen here, and we have photographic evidence of the atrocities committed by Leopold in Congo. Now listen, the problem was, how are you going to get an entire population to do this extraction for you? You needed some sort of, let's just say, enforcement mechanism. What the Belgians come up with is this. They are called the Force Publique, the public forces. A sort of military police, tasked not with enforcing the laws, but enforcing Leopold's laws, specifically around the rubber quotas. But because this was a for-profit operation, this police force was under that exact same requirement. And that specifically involves things like bullets. You see, soldiers would be told that bullets were expensive. And so if a soldier was to fire their gun, they needed to ensure that each bullet was accounted for. That one shot equaled one kill. Soldiers were expected to prove this. How? Well, every time someone was shot, soldiers would take out a knife and chop off a body part as a souvenir. When they came home, the bullets were counted. All right, you left with 20 bullets. You came back with 18, so you shot 2. Can you show me who you shot at? 1 mutilated body part, 2 mutilated body parts. Okay, you're clear to go. Oh, we have 1 bullet missing. That's going to be docked from your pay. Setting aside the many, 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 many problems with this, there's a very practical problem with this. Humans aren't perfect shots. Which means, what happens when you miss? Suddenly, these individuals think to themselves, oh my God, my pay is going to be docked or worse unless I come up with a body part. Understand what I'm saying? What the Congo Free State created was a marketplace for human body parts. Now, my next slide, I have the most disturbing picture of the class so far. It just is. So, sensitive to mutilated body parts, gore, you can tap out here. It's been a pleasure to see you tonight. I'll see you in our next class. But I think if you share my level of melanin, you should know what was done here. You should. This is a thing that you kind of owe to these people to witness their suffering. Because what happens in Congo is so bad that the other imperial countries think to themselves, whoa, 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 we're not this bad. Mark Twain, at the height of the racist response to Reconstruction, would travel to Congo and be shocked by the conditions in Congo. I want to highlight this. Mark Twain lived through the Civil War, goes to the Congo Free State, and is horrified by the things he sees in the Congo. Have I set the stage yet? Anyone scared to look at this has left already? Okay. I want to show you the image of the impact of imperialism. What you're looking at here is a father looking at the mutilated hand and feet of his daughter, who, based on the size, would have likely been around 10 when this happened. Our understanding of the background of this picture is that the child had not met her rubber quota for that season. And as punishment, a guard, who was short 2 bullets, decided to mutilate her and take the body parts back for his accounting. Imperialism is one thing in the theory, in the economic mind of someone like Lenin. But this is what imperialism looks like. This is what imperialism feels like. And so I hope, as we move on, that this image crystallizes in your mind about what this actually was in Asia and in Africa. What this looked like, what this meant. Because a country like Congo is still feeling the effects of this over 150 years later. So, let me remove this from your screen so you don't have to keep getting traumatized. Ladies, gents, and everyone in between, that's our show. Our next lecture is going to be the first lecture of Unit 3, where we talk about the First World War. So, ladies, gents, everyone in between, I'll see you for it. Have a very good night, everyone. Peace out.